All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here. We're letting people sort of get settled, come in, connect to audio. We're so excited that you are here for our summer blitz session that we're super excited about compassionate and equitable grading. So definitely get set. I will tell you, you might want to open like a Google Doc or have something to write with near you, because in a moment we'll be doing some reflecting and writing, and we'll have a couple of opportunities throughout also to do that work. All right. If you haven't yet, now is a great time to sign in. We were kind of spamming it in the waiting room, but you can use the QR code and we will get the link also back in the chat for those of you that are just entering our space today. This is how you will get your sketch credit. So definitely make sure that you sign in and use the form that is either through the QR code or on the chat. No problem. Yeah, we are here to be sure that you get the credit that you need. So all that is good. As you're signing in and you're thinking about getting your pick number and all that good stuff that you need to do, we're also going to ask you just to introduce yourself in the chat. So if you wouldn't mind telling us your name, where you teach, what grade level you teach, and if you're using any compassionate or equitable grading strategies already. Doesn't matter how big or small you think they are. We want to hear about them. So if you've got that, we're ready for you. It's good to see some elementary folks here. I know sometimes the question comes up, what does grading have to do with me? Lots. It has lots to do. Including setting up mindsets for later. So that's great. Good to see folks. Wyandotte well represented today. Hello, Trenton, Southgate. Love to see our downriver friends here. That's awesome. That's great. Cool. Again, if you're using any alternative grading practices right now, big or small, just let us know too. Cool. That's great. Hi, Darcy.
Good.
From Grosse
Yeah.
Pointe. Heather and I were over on the east side earlier, so hello from hello to east sider. We passed you. That's great. All right. Feel free to keep introducing yourself using the chat. Awesome. Literacy interventionist D7. That's awesome.
Nice.
Cool. Feel free to keep introducing yourselves. We'll roll with it here. My name's Jeff Austin. I use he, him pronouns. And I'm a literacy consultant here at RISA. I've been on my ungrading or grading less journey, however you want to phrase it, for a little more than a decade. And so this work is really near and dear to my heart. I think one of the things that probably saved my teaching career in a lot of ways was leaning into alternative and equitable and compassionate grading practices, largely because it helped my relationships with students. I didn't want to be an adversary to my students, but I feel like grading puts us at odds. It puts us on the opposite sides of the table, and I just couldn't do that anymore and be the teacher that I wanted to be. So I had to figure something out, and so we'll hear bits and pieces of my little origin story here today, but that's definitely part of it for me. And I just thank you for having the courage and compassion to be here and talk about this topic, which is just I think something that's very hard to talk about for reasons we'll talk about today. But grading is so interwoven into our system. Rethinking it is really, really hard, particularly because we all have a grading experience also. Heather?
Hi, everyone. Heather Rottermond, assessment and instruction consultant. I've also been on a grading journey. I left the classroom quite a while ago. But while I was in the classroom, I was starting to play with different ways and structures of grading, and different ways to give feedback to students. So you'll hear a little bit of that, even though I've been away from it for a little bit. You'll hear how Jeff and I continue to support educators in Wayne County around grading practices.
As always, we like to begin our sessions with a land acknowledgement. Really connecting to the land is very important to us. There are so many stories in our region, and we always, in any space that we're in, try to make sure that we uplift that and point that out. Our land acknowledgement today is brought to you by Healing by Choice, which is a woman and gender nonconforming organization that operates here locally. We begin by honoring the ancestral land on which we live, the indigenous land of the Anishinaabe people of the Three Fires, Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi. Detroit is the largest majority Black city in the nation, with a long legacy of African diasporic global contributions, which was once one of the last stops on the Underground Railroad, known by its codename Midnight. Detroit is also the US city with the largest concentration of Arab Americans, a border city with historic and growing Latino, Latina, Latinx communities, and a legacy of Asian American communities and movements. We acknowledge this land, its history, all the being seen and unseen, known and unknown as we step in to work on this land, most of us as uninvited guests. We offer this work in the spirit of reparation, devoting ourselves to justice as we strive to uplift the legacy of this land.
So for our session today, we have an ambitious session um, and an ambitious agenda, but for our session, we're going to engage in a quick connector, which will kind of ground us for some of the discussions and things we have later on in the session. So we'll talk about our personal grading stories. We'll also talk about why we're here and what are some of the issues that educators are running up against with traditional grading practices and systems. We'll explore different options for grading, and we'll talk a little bit about everyday advocacy and some of the things that you can do to move toward a more compassionate and equitable grading practices, but also how you can advocate for it. And then we'll adjourn with our next steps.
Yes, that is ambitious. I'm glad you pointed that out. It is that truer words were never spoken. Before we dive into our stories, I think we do need to point this out, right? And that is, as we were talking about earlier, grading is so interwoven into what we think school is. Judgment is woven into what we think school is. That it can be very, very hard to separate grading from the school experience. And as you heard in the agenda, you might say, but I have to give grades. And that may be true, but we'll talk about ways that, again, we can move toward doing that in more equitable and compassionate ways. The mandates of learning are such, especially right now, in our culture, that learning is very linear. It happens at the same rate, at the same time for everyone. But we know that's not true. There are wide variations in human development and human achievement. And so we're kind of working with those and through those. It's okay that it's messy. And grading, I think, to the extent that we use it, really should probably honor the fact that learning is really messy. It's really nonlinear. Achievement varies. Um, and that people are kind of and can be on different timelines. Similarly, I think too, our journey toward grading less or becoming gradeless needs to also kind of keep this in mind and reflect this also, right? It's Heather and I have tried 100 different ways to give feedback, 100 different ways to improve our grading practices, 100 different ways to grade less. It's about finding out what works for you in your context with your students in your school. And it's good to see a lot of people from the same district here because it also requires working really across systems, which we'll talk about later also. But if things make you uncomfortable today or push on an edge that you have about grading, that's great. That's why we're here. We grow in those spaces. So if you do feel discomfort today, know that that's really natural in these kinds of conversations. Heather, you want to kick us off with our connector and get people into our stories?
Yes, yes. This is a quote from Sean Michael Morris, and it comes from when we talk about grades, we're talking about people. So I'll read the quote, and as I'm reading, think about your own grading or assessment experience that really stands out to you. But it'll make more sense once I read the quote to you. Grades hamstring us by their very nature. Grades get soaked into the learning identity of the student who gets them, whether they get straight A's or they're a solid B student or they receive the occasional F. After college and amongst friends, we might even bond over the kinds of grades we got. The geniuses who nearly failed out, the up by the bootstraps first generation student who had to work while at school but earned their 4.0, the happy slackers who contented themselves with C's. We continue to talk about grades long after they've ceased to matter because they mark us indelibly. We continue to talk about grades long after they cease to have matter because they mark us indelibly. And it's just as important to recognize that indelible mark as it is to recognize that if grades can cease to matter at some point in our lives, it might stand to reason that they never really mattered in the first place. So I want you to take a moment to think and reflect on a grading or an assessment experience that marked you indelibly. What did it happen? How did it matter? And why might it continue to matter? And then after a few moments of reflection, we'll have an opportunity to share our experiences. Okay. Hopefully you were able to think about an experience. Sometimes this comes rather quickly. Sometimes we have to really think about it. And we're going to put you into breakout rooms for a few minutes and allow you to share in smaller groups about your experience that marked you indelibly. Um, Feel free to share if you're open to sharing. You don't have to, knowing that grading can in these experiences can be deeply personal. So I'm going to put you into breakout rooms.
Welcome back. We're just waiting on the last few breakout rooms to close. All right. Welcome back, everybody. Hope we know that was not probably enough time to share and dig in. Like Heather said, we've got an ambitious agenda. But hopefully this also gets you thinking a little bit about your origin stories. One of the people that we really respect and admire in the ungrading world is David Buck. And we asked him, what you what was your origin story? What brought you to this, right? And so and he was like, wow, no, I don't think I've ever really wrestled with that or grappled with that. But we all come to sessions like this for a reason, and unpacking that reason, even if Heather said it sometimes hurts or it feels like there's some trauma involved, can be really helpful in moving forward and understand why we're doing what we're doing or why we're trying to rethink the things that we're trying to rethink. So thank you for sharing. We will not make you share in the public space. We know that these stories are very, very vulnerable. And speaking of David Buck and another of our favorites, Asao Inoue, um, we've used this term compassionate a lot already. And you might be wondering, like, what does it mean to move toward compassion? What does that look like? What does it feel like? What does it sound like? And David Buck and Asao Inoue both use in their classrooms what they call the Charter for Compassion. And this is a glimpse into what's kind of in that charter, and how they structure and orient their classrooms toward compassion. And I really think that these things are beautiful. And I think they can work with learners of any age, including adult learners, to really think about how we act compassionately. Um, and this is open material, so if you see something you really like here, feel free to take it, feel free to use it. But we give credit to Asao and David for great work here, and how they structure their courses. So these are again some tangible ways that we get to a more compassionate education system and more compassionate classrooms. All right. Hopefully, what this is a picture of. If not, it will become clear in a second. But this is a grub. And I think one of the things that pushes us away from compassion is sometimes the language we use around students, or the language that might be used in our spaces and our school systems around students and about students. And this is a grub. And as you can see, no offense to grubs, but they are unpleasant creatures. That is not a nice looking thing. Um, and so one of the terms that I think we frequently use to describe students who may be interested in grades or might be fueled by grades is we sometimes call them grade grubbers. Now, I don't think any of us on this call think about our students like this creature that we see here, but we use the term. So language can orient us to deficit. And so we use that term grade grubber. But I think it moving away from terms like this as an example is really important. Students are not at fault necessarily for chasing points or grubbing for grades. This is the way that they've been systematized to be in school. And so if we don't like the way that they're being socialized into school, it's our responsibility at individual and collective levels to make the change that's needed to live into something different. So systemic failures do not belong on our students' shoulders, but we often put them there through the language we use. So grade grubber, point chaser, all of these things have really negative connotations, but they also are primarily out of students' control. This is how they've been socialized. This is how they've been brought in. So if we say, don't chase points or don't grub for grades, but we've set systems up that encourage them to do exactly that. And not any individual in here or any individual in the teaching profession is totally at fault for this. But if we have systems that move in that direction, then we have to change those systems. And part of changing systems means changing language and how we describe kids. So this is one way immediately. Tomorrow, you could be more compassionate. Is just watching the language you use. Because even if you're intentional, some of this stuff can seep in. And we want to make sure that we're avoiding that to the extent that we can. All right, we're gonna play a little game. Are you ready? Heather, you ready to play our little game? So
I'm ready.
get your chat window up. So we're gonna ask you some questions, and we want to know what's the issue with whatever we show you on the screen. So we're going to show you some common grading practices, and we want you to think about what might be the issue with these grading
Oh, you can leave it on.
practices. So we're going to think about that. Here we go. Here's number one. So get your chat into the space where you can type. We're going to kind of go rapid fire here. What's the issue with maybe averaging student scores across a term or a semester? Or even a whole marking period. Think about that. You can feel free to use the chat.
Yes, Rob.
Rob, that's awesome. Yes. They prioritize. We got it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yes. So it burdens them to the past.
Yes.
And we want to reward growth, right? We want to reward improvement. But this tethers them to before, right? Anything else, Heather?
I love that it penalizes students for beginning learning experiences. Like that
Yes.
is that's a great point. It certainly does that. Does
All right.
not highlight best achievements, equity with the assignments. That's another
That's
thing
another
that
one.
is,
Areas of strength. Okay. We're cooking, folks. All right. Here's the next one. Oops. Now here's the next one. Curving student scores and summative assessments. This feels good. This is like a little sugar high. But what might be the problems?
it takes me back to college,
Yes.
undergrad.
Takes me back to high school science, maybe even where curving would be like let's say the top score is a 70% and I make the 70% a 100%. Right. So I say, okay, I'm going to curve everybody by 30. Tina,
Yes.
you're in. What are grades supposed to do? Communicate, right? Communicate understanding of content, communicate the skill and the actual ability that you have. This gets messy, right? When we start curving scores. Because
Yes,
now
Jeff.
it looks like, yeah, there you go. Falsely shows kind, right?
Yes.
See, we don't want to do that, right? Because we are going to say that grades matter, then they have to communicate something of value. So if I really got to, if I really only understand 70% of the content, but you're giving me 100, that gives me a inflated view. It might give my caregiver an inflated view too about what I know and what I can do. All right, here we go. There's two more. This is a hot one. Using zeros on a 100-point scale. What's the problem? Yes, and thanks, Charisse. That's yes, that's nail bullseye, nail in the head. Zeros on a 100-point scale. What's the issue?
Ooh, I battled this one when I was still
Oh, me,
teaching.
me too. Me too. You can check the scars, right? Bigger range for failure. That's right. Tina hates zeros. Yes. If I get a zero, what does it matter if I do this or not? Yeah, greater range for failure, Rob. Totally. Yes. Great, great.
Puts them in the mathematical hole that they can never climb out of.
You can never get out of it.
Never.
We just talked about averaging student scores, but if you're averaging zeros in there, holy cow, right? How do I ever, ever, ever recover? Even if I want to.
Even if I want to.
And Heather knows this about me. Yes, zero. They often shut down. Yes, that's totally true. Hope is important. I have to be able to believe that I can. Aside from it being mathematically indefensible, it's hard to hope if I'm getting weighed down by all these zeros. And Heather knows this about me, but another part of my origin story is I was a little bit of a knucklehead in school. And so I got lots of zeros, right, over the course of time. Eventually, you just don't care anymore, right? Like, what's another zero out of the many, many, many that I've received? And so if I don't have hope, and it's not good feedback. Yes, zeros when averaged, it's a big problem, right? Putting that average in there. Okay, last one. This is another hot one. We're going right for it today, including attendance and tardy data in student grades. What's our issue? Christine, we'll shout you out on that too. We'll talk about that a little later. We'll be sure we get into that for sure. And you can feel free to always bring up opposing viewpoints, right? It's not super clean and clear all the time.
Ah, yes, Danielle.
Yeah, Danielle, kids don't get themselves there, so sometimes that's really hard, right? Like I'm not responsible. Yes, Rob with the tongue in cheek there about the Kleenex boxes and the pencils and the Clorox wipes for a bunch of points. Yeah, right. It makes things messy, right? It's kind of the theme. Um, again, if we're interested in communicating something accurate, that's really tough. It's really tough to do if you're including that. We'll talk about another issue too in just a second, but
And that last one could land you in some hot water, like legal troubles.
yes, yes.
Because of, kids are required to be at school, but yes, they're there. And there's been court cases where grades have had to be changed because of the inclusion of attendance and tardy.
Um, and to your points in the chat and to Heather's points, maybe the similarities that exist here are all of these render grades pretty inaccurate, right? They tamper with the accuracy. So if we're if you came here and you said, I think traditional grading is really great, and I think we should kind of stick with the system. Okay, but I think it's also relevant that we need to deal with these things also because they are rendering the grade to be less accurate than we would want it to be because it's infused with a whole bunch of noise. We want mostly signal. I don't know that it'll ever be 100% signal, but we want mostly signal, and we want to limit the noise, right? I think that's what we're trying to get at. All right, and we've talked about all of these things already, but there are a bunch of issues with traditional grading, and you've put them out there in the chat already. And when we're talking about traditional grading, Heather and I, we're kind of thinking about the A to F or A to E 0 to 100 scale. That's kind of what we. But we've talked about how averaging scores can't account for growth, or at least makes it hard to account for growth. We talked about how curving assessments kind of disrupts what students know and are able to do, and it transmits maybe a false narrative about student achievement to the students themselves, but also to the people that are at home. We'll talk about deservedness in a second, but traditional grading that includes behavior and tardy data and attendance data, that gets into, I think, some tricky situations, certainly legally, as Heather just brought up, but also maybe morally and ethically. And then you hit the nail on the head, chat. Zeros on a 100-point scale does create mathematical inequity and also potentially a sense of hopelessness. I can never dig out of it, particularly if that score is being averaged over and over and over again. So thanks. We were right on it. Okay, I want to talk about this concept of deservedness for just a second. Because brought it up back here, right? That in this third box that it fosters deservedness and invites bias. So I just want you to think really quickly. What do we want grading to do or not do in our classes? What do we want grading to do or not do in our classes? Give you like 30 seconds to think about that. You jot it down, you can put it in the chat. And thanks for that too, but I was here and I should have an A argument. Talk about that in a second too. So what do you want grading to do or not do in your classes? Right. This is a good question from Jesse Stommel. We'll have a link to some of his stuff really at the end, and that you can check out.
Yeah, Christine, what they are learning and mastering, showing accuracy,
Measuring growth.
measuring
Beautiful.
growth.
That's
Yes.
what we want. Awesome. You can keep those coming too. Couple of quotes here. Heather, do you want to give us the Cornelius Minor quote, and I'll do the Joe Feldman quote?
That's perfect.
Beautiful.
I love Cornelius Minor. If you've not ever read any of his work, he's absolutely brilliant. You can, and his books are really easy to read, and he provides really practical strategies for teachers in the classroom. He also plays devil advocate in a lot of his work. Like he'll say like what's kind of like, the narrative that's currently happening and like what you could do differently. So his work is absolutely amazing. So even though grading is about proficiency, it often gets conflated with behavior. You can have a student who is proficient at calculus, but if the teacher doesn't like the fact that they are consistently late to class, that kid gets marked down. Again, there's an unspoken pact teachers have with their children. I will agree to teach you well if you demonstrate to me that you deserve it.
And Joe Feldman says this about zeros and compliance and deservedness. A humbling but reluctantly honest reason many of us continue to use the zero on a 100-point scale may be because the zero satisfies a psychological need. Well, Reeves, he's referring to a different author, sardonically recognizes teachers' need to punish the little miscreants who fail to complete our assignments. This need among us to feel satisfaction, to hold our students accountable for not following our directions is very real and powerful. So when we think about this, um, you know, when we think about moving away from traditional grades and into something that's more equitable and compassionate, we're thinking about moving away from power. We're thinking about moving away from control, from command and compliance, but also, and I think this is where the deservedness part comes in, how good we are. Somewhere along the line, good grades got associated with being a good person. And there's like this moral attribute to it. And that is also really I think a little bit problematic and something to wrestle with, right? Just because you've gotten really high grades and high scores does not necessarily mean that you are a good person or that you um, are morally superior. Just as if you get low grades, you're not morally inferior either, right? You're not a bad person or a bad student per se, right? So separating out the achievement from the moral or the achievement from the personal seems really important also. Because they get tied together a lot, and that has real impacts on how students see themselves, how they see each other, and their self-efficacy really. And so that's this is a little tricky, but it's like it's something I think have to work ourselves away from, right?
Yes, yes, yes. Look at the software that we're required to use.
Oh,
Jeff and
well,
I talk about
oh,
hacking the grade book all the time. How do we make it work?
yes, amen. I mean, this is a selling point of LMS software, right? Is that
Yep.
it connects with the grade book easily, but there are flaws and problems with that, which is why, to Heather's point, it requires hacking. Um,
Mhm.
and you can there's all kinds of politics involved in that also, of course. But yeah, it's like if you want to do alternative grading, there's lots of effort on your part to sort of hack your system, whatever it might be, whether it's MyStar or Power School or like whatever. There's hacks you have to do. Okay. Some people might say, and you might be saying this right now to us, which is fine. I have to give grades. Like I'm obligated. I'm required. It is part of my duty. This is totally true. We know. We've been there. We've lived it, right? We know that grades are part of it. And while you might go, hey, there's output that I have to give. Yes, there has to be a grade on that report card 4 times a year. I know. Um, there's no way around that part. But the inputs, how the grade actually gets given and figured out, you actually do have some agency and control over in most cases, right? Um, and so how it gets earned, how it gets logged into the system, those are kinds of different conversations and places where you can actually hack your own practices to be a little bit more compassionate. Um, we've already talked about this a lot today, but minimum grading. This is making it so there aren't 60 gradations of failure, right? But so we're orienting ourselves around a Heather talks about this a lot, but like a 0 to 4 system or a 1 to 4 system maybe might be better if you're interested in using that kind of scale. Anything you want to say about that scale?
I would, yeah. So the
Yeah.
proficiency levels,
Yes.
often what they're called. Um, but they're helpful, but part of that work comes with like shared understanding of like really what each proficiency level looks like, and what it looks like in practice too. So it's really good to, a lot of schools will put these on paper, But then when it comes time to complete the report card or put something in the grade book, they're like, I don't know. So having shared conversation, sharing of practice, sharing of student work can help refine, but also provide a shared understanding around what each of those levels can look like. I'm also, I mean, this can also be related to even the use of your rubrics, moving away from the different gradations on a rubric, because there could be many, and only looking at a single point on a rubric.
The single point rubric, speaking to my heart. There you go. I talked about my origin story a little earlier, how I came to think about grading practices differently. This was really one of my first forays into the space was delayed grading. Some people use process letters, which I think are also really amazing. But what this meant for me was before a student got a grade in the grade book, they had to do some reflection on the feedback that I gave them and either talk to me about it or fill out a form depending on how they felt or what they wanted to do. And then I would put the grade in the grade book once they've had some time to reflect. So and Heather and I have written about this, but the further you can get feedback away from a grade, and not just Heather and I, many people have written about this. The further you can get feedback away from a grade, the better, right? The further you can separate those things in somebody's mind. So if the gratifications, so to speak, is delayed a little bit, that can be beneficial. Process letters, just like having kids describe how they arrived at that final product and what they did, that can be helpful too. I never use that as much, but I did use delayed grading. Um, this is something I use a lot, and something I know some other folks in the educational community use a lot, which is self-reported grades and grade pitches. So Heather, you did such a great job of describing the rubrics, the problems with rubrics, how we can make them better. That single point rubric, I think, really opens up the grade pitching conversation because you're looking at what the standard is and you're thinking about exemplars of that work potentially, and you're having a conversation with a kid about where you think that they land, right? Are you a 4, 3, a 2, or 1? Why? Let's look at these exemplars. Let's look at these levels. Let's think about what they mean together. So this like really leans into our workshopping and conferencing. Um, and it gives kids some agency and autonomy. So grading is not something that's done to them. It's something that's done in conversation in conjunction with them. You might say, but Jeff, like everybody's going to say that they want an A, right? And actually the research on grade pitching and self-reported grades is that people rate themselves lower artificially. But also if let's say somebody did do that, let's say Heather comes to me and we're conferencing and she's like, this is a 4 or an A or however your system is. That's when we can go back to exemplars or the levels or the standard and go, do we really think that's the case? Do we really honestly believe that? And then, talk about why that is or isn't. So, most people are receptive to that conversation. Heather, do you want to, you've got some good responsive reassessment policies. Do you want to give maybe an example or two?
Yeah. So in my classroom, I when students didn't do so well on the assessment, they could always retake it. I always allowed retakes. And it didn't mean that the retakes were unlimited, right? Um, but I had some parameters around how and when that would happen. Students had to show me, a little bit of the work that they've put in. And they could either conference with me, we could do some reteaching, or they could show me some of the studying that they had done around a particular concept. But they wouldn't get to take the entire test. I would only retest them on the piece or of the learning target or the standard that they missed. So it helped alleviate some anxiety with testing, knowing that they wouldn't have to retake the entire test. They just had to retake the portion of the test that they really missed. And most often, having this as a retake policy in my classroom, kids studied for the test. Like I really didn't have a ton of kids taking advantage of it, like because they didn't do the work. They knew that the work that was leading up to the assessment was truly preparing them for the assessment. So it meant that I had to be really intentional with what I gave as a task. It had to be relevant and connected, but also connected to what I was assessing on too. So That was just one way with which how I handled it. I taught middle school. Um, and I found it to be really easy. And I would do the retake in class.
Hmm.
So I structured my class so a student wasn't missing their lunch. They weren't missing, another class to retake. It was done in my classroom.
I love that one. I taught econ for a while, and I was kind of struggling with kids. The graphing can kind of throw kids off in econ. It's tough. But actually having them do it, giving them a problem, showing them just do it in front of me on the board, right? While we're sitting there, and talk me through it, like that can be a good reassessment, right? Because you're watching them think and act in real time. Um, and
What
so
were
that
the
was
other?
efficient.
That's a good, that I love that. That's very
Yeah.
responsive. So Danielle, you had a good question. What are the
Yep.
other kids doing? The other kids, I taught ELA, so and kids had like choice time. They could be working on like choice reading, choice writing. So it didn't, I tried to do as minimal interruption of like actual instructional time, but kids were able to the other kids were reading or writing during that time. So no new content was being missed because a child had to retake. That's part of, being not only responsive, but also equitable. I didn't want the child to miss any sort of content from any other teacher as well. So it just happened in my classroom and it worked for me. But I also didn't give them crazy long tests. I gave them really, like I was really deliberate with how I structured my assessments. And they were often, I mean, a lot of it could have been done through a conference, like Jeff had mentioned.
Yeah, that's another good question that Jeff's bringing up in the chat. And this is another hot button issue, right? So I taught in a school that had an 80 for a while, that had an 80-20 system for mastery versus what they call process, or summative informative. Um, and there were some people that really believe that if you're taking it the second time, the highest you can get was 80. And there were others who believed that if you're showing mastery, why isn't the full allotment of points available to you? Particularly going back to our earlier conversation, if we're really rewarding growth, um, then it makes sense that I should be able to get the full range of points that are available to me. Then that opens up questions like, well, if a kid gets a 99, are we retaking, and all that stuff? But I think you can have like pretty healthy parameters around that kind of thing. And that's where I think it's useful, maybe as a department or a school, to have those kinds of conversations, to say, like, what are some reasonable parameters here around reassessment? Because Heather, you didn't let kids retake endlessly, right? If we're on retake 8, right, I think that we can have a different conversation, but certainly before 8. But
Exactly. And Jeff, because they were retaking the portion that they didn't
yeah,
do
that's
well
another good
on,
point.
I just regraded the assessment. So, but I would include that as part of the original score. So kids could go up from their original score. It wasn't limited to just an 80. So if I had 4 parts, A, B, C, or D, and they had to retake part A, then I just factored in that new part A into the score.
And I think there's like lots of openness for conversation about this. But the one thing I just would say that I probably wouldn't do, or would advise against, is averaging the two scores together, right?
Yeah.
For all the reasons we've already talked about.
Yep.
All right. Another thing that you can do is you can rethink your LMS setup. And we've had that conversation already today too. And you can hack it, essentially. Maybe that's another session, Heather. We're talking about hacking these LMSs. All right. So Heather and I also wanted to talk about what this means systemically, right? These things exist on a continuum. And there are things that we have control over in our individual classrooms, but that we don't have control over systemically. So like I can do delayed grading or minimum grading in my classroom. It's better for all doing it, probably. But I can do it in my classroom, and I may have control over those inputs, but some of the bigger things, like Heather was alluding to, kind of talking about some of the issues around standards-based grading, when you get into those gradations and what does this mean? What is a 4? Right? You're having those kinds of conversations. That has to be done as a team, right? That really you it's hard to do alone, if we're being honest. So some of this again is very individualized, but systemically we can start to move toward other ways of grading. And I want to say I'm gonna do my best to channel my inner Bettina Love here, because she has a really great talk about this. But you know, um, for all of the difficulty and sadness and isolation of the pandemic, it showed us that things were possible that we never thought were possible before. And um, including a lot of schools shifting their grading systems away from that traditional AF 0-100 scale into something that looked different. And so if you're willing to play that hand in crisis, let's keep that energy in 2024, in 2025, in 2026 and beyond. Because we now know that different is possible. So a lot of people went to pass fail grading, credit, no credit. Those can be options in certain spaces. Now, again, you don't want to talk about what that meant and how that looked, and you'd have to communicate with your caregivers and families. But a different world is possible, and we were shown that. So you just think about this is kind of a continuum, and this continuum is huge. Um, okay. Um, Alfie Kohn, he talks a lot about this. It is great if we are using um, alternative grading practices in our classroom. So we're using delayed grading, or we're using process letters, or conferencing, or whatever. But eventually, right, the true power in it is branching out from there. But as Heather and I alluded to, it is hard to have these conversations as a staff. Um, Generative conflict around grades and grading is hard. It's really difficult. We are not generally equipped for generative conflict as a society. So then you get into hot button issues like this, where people have passionate arguments and passionate thoughts. It can be tricky if you're not if you haven't set the stage and built the foundations and set the system. Um, but there are ways still that we can advocate for something different or something better. And Kathy Fleischer and Antero Garcia wrote a really beautiful, accessible book called Everyday Advocacy. This is about teachers changing the narrative in their schools. They lay out this plan that makes advocacy safer and more sustainable across our schools. So we move from identifying a small concern and narrowing that concern down. So you're not going to be like, probably not the best way to advocate is we're going to just totally overthrow the system. As much as maybe some of us on here would like that, that's usually not an effective way to get change done. And so, think about your building, think about your district, think about your school. What's right for change right now, right? Is it maybe minimum grading? Is it maybe thinking about feedback practices? Is it maybe a little LMS hacking? And then figure out how you can talk to different people in different groups about what that would look like in me. And so you're having a conversation with students. And I think speaking with students about a different grading future is really powerful. It's maybe one of the most powerful things we can do. But also speaking to, again, families and caregivers, our administrators, our colleagues, our school board members. It's all part of a really vast fabric of a better future, and really a more just and equitable future, and a more compassionate future for ourselves and for our kids. Anything you want to say about advocacy, Heather?
The only thing that I would add would be that grading as we have it now is like it's traditional, it's very steeped in and rooted in I mean, we've been using the same system for a long time. And because other things always surface up as being important, grading and assessment practices are often like pushed to the side. And so when you try to make change with grading or even initiate the conversation, like Jeff had mentioned, you can be met with some pushback. Often because this is how I've always done it. This is my philosophy. Um, but it's often because it's what was done to us, right? We often replicate some of those practices that we've inherited, um, you know, along the way as learners, also through student teaching. So um, I love this idea of advocating in really small ways, and being mindful of the things that you can do with how you grade in your classroom, and being able to advocate for those practices to expand.
Um, it's it's 4 o'clock, and we need to set these people on their way. Um, However, we were going to answer some rapid fire questions about some that we hear about grading. Many of you asked these in the chat, so we were kind of on the mark with some of these questions. Um, Heather, would you be open to potentially, you know, later or maybe tomorrow at some point, maybe we jump back on and we can record a quick video talking about these that we can send out with the slides?
Yeah,
Would that be good so that we can keep
absolutely.
people on time? But we do want to answer these questions and answer the questions that you were asking in the chat that are adjacent to these questions. We'll make sure that video that we record gets sent to you. But you can always feel free to reach out to us also in that way. Last thing we'll say before we head off, because we do want to keep you on time. We know that this is a really, really busy time of year. Um, Wherever you are in this journey, wherever you are in this process, there is an entry point for you. These are a bunch of different entry points that you might want to click on. You'll get the slide deck. These are all clickable links. You can click on some of these and figure out what works for you. But Heather, I want to leave on this point that you just made that's also up here from Schneider and Hunt. Grading remains a central feature of nearly every student's and teachers' and parents' school experience. As such, it can be easy to perceive them as both fixed and inevitable, without origin or evolution. An effect of this is that despite their limitations, grades are often accepted quite uncritically by all parties involved. If anything, this year, if you're thinking about this, just being more critical, getting your students to be more critical about grades, thinking differently about them, that's a huge step in the right direction and a huge win. Thank you for being here today and settling in. We're going to make sure you get all these materials. We appreciate you. This is a hard topic, but we're grateful for your time.
We also have I'm going to pitch our responsive
Oh,
assessment
yeah,
network.
let me go to that slide.
We have a network. We meet quarterly and we just talk about all of these things. We problem solve. We learn together, and it's virtual. So it's like I think it's 90 minutes, and it's after school. So these are the dates that we plan to meet and talk about all of these things that we've talked about today, but also the things that are actually happening inside the classroom so that we can help you um, move toward more equitable and compassionate grading practices.
Oh, how do they join that? Can we get these people a link?
Yes, let me drop it in.
All
Let me
right.
drop it in. Let me pull it up and then let me drop it in.
Here it is. We'd love to see you at the Responsive Assessment Network.
Yes, yes, yes.
Because as Heather said, this is a place and time for us to like really dig into these issues and again talk about those really specific things that are happening in your spaces and do that problem solving. Thank you, everybody. We definitely appreciate your time and your thoughts and your brilliance. Have a great year.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.